Okay, welcome back. So this video is going to discuss arguably the most important modifier in all of hard surface modeling, and it is the bevel modifier. So before we even go over the bevel modifier, I want to showcase some artworks that I really enjoy and how exactly these artists use bevels in their work. So here's a real world example with Boston Dynamics. You've probably seen their robots before. Crazy cool. And you can see nearly every area on their mesh, actually not nearly, literally every area on their mesh has some form of a bevel on it. You can zoom in here, you can see that nice rounded area. There's a nice little bevel there, even on the front. Literally everywhere there's a bevel, and as a matter of fact, no real-world object can exist without a bevel. Even a piece of paper, if you zoomed in far enough microscopically, you'd eventually be able to see a little bevel on the edge of the paper. Nothing is perfectly sharp, so that's one reason we add bevels. Another reason we add bevels is to capture edge reflection. So here's a little turntable model I created for one of my courses, and if we really zoom in here, you can see, for example, there's a bevel where this little capsule is. If we zoom in, you can see that there's a nice amount of light kind of captured and reflecting off the edge there. Same for over here. Pretty much everywhere there's a bevel, there's some form of light reflecting off of it. Now, if this was perfectly sharp, you wouldn't see that light reflection at all, and it would just look dull and boring, and something would seem off. I'll quickly go through some of my other favorite pieces of art. So here's one by one of my favorite artists, Edon Grazio. I'm pretty sure I pronounced his name correctly. He's a fantastic artist. You can follow him on ArtStation. Here's an example of one of his works, and you can see he incorporates bevels very nicely in his models. Here is one of Ryu's models. You can follow him on ArtStation as well. You can see all of this here has a nice bevel. This was actually made in Blender, as a matter of fact. All the areas have a nice little bevel on it capturing the light. You can especially see it here. This bevel has some nice light reflection, so it's super important for that nice little design. We can go down here, you can see another one of his models. Bevels basically everywhere. And then we'll just go to a few more of my favorites. So here's another fantastic work by Vitaly Bulgarov. You've probably seen his work before. He's an absolutely amazing artist, one I look up to very heavily, and you can see in his models he also has bevels all added in there. So you can definitely check out some of his work to see more of that. Here's another one of Ryu's models, bevels everywhere. And then another one of my favorite artists, Ivan Santic. He has some really cool concept and military type designs that have a lot of bevels inside of them as well. Anyways, at this point, I think you get the memo as to why bevels are important. So I want to quickly demonstrate what it looks like with a bevel and what it looks like without a bevel, because it might not seem like it's that important, but you'll see once I turn it off how important it is. So here's one of my more basic models here. You can see there's bevels pretty much over all the edges. So if I select this and turn off the bevel modifier, look at that. Looks absolutely terrible. And you can't quite tell what it is, but I can pretty much point out exactly what it is. If you take a look, once the bevel hits, we get all of these nice light reflections, especially right here. You can see a very defined light reflection versus if it was turned off, there's no light reflection. So you can really see the difference in how much it really starts to pull out your models. Anyways, now that we understand why we need bevels in our hard surface models, we can go ahead and go over a little bit of the bevel modifier. So I'm going to go to Add Modifier, add a bevel, and you're going to see that we have this offset option that simply allows us to increase the bevel or decrease it. Most of the time in hard surface, you only need a very slight bevel. There's no need to go crazy high. And then usually I'll have like 3 or 5 segments. I usually keep it at an odd number for no particular reason. So yeah, 3 to 5 segments is usually plenty, because once you go any higher, it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of shading. So yeah, I'll usually do around 5 segments, a very tight offset, just enough to capture the light. And then of course we also have to shade smooth and turn on our auto smoothing. So you can see how nice this already makes the cube look. You can see if I turn it off and back on, looks pretty decent. Another thing we sometimes turn on is harden normals or use a weighted normal. We'll have a separate video on that, but basically it just makes the shading look better as a very generic explanation. Now we also have the bevel profile. This either makes things concave or convex. You can take a look here. That's convex, and at a value of 0 is a concave bevel. I rarely adjust the profile. I usually leave it at 0.5 or maybe a little bit higher. Now we also have this thing here called a miter type. This is super important and practical. Actually, a lot of people overlook this, including myself. For many months I never really messed with these, but they're actually super useful. So if I were to add in a cut right here, for example, I'm just using box cutter once again, and maybe I'll just, I don't know, tighten the offset a little bit. It doesn't have to be that big of a bevel. But if you go into the corners here, you can really see it's a very defined triangle. It's kind of pinching, and that's because the outer miter type is set to sharp. Usually we can change this to something like patch or even arc, and if sometimes the shading goes bad, you can turn on hard and normals to clean that up. So you can see what patch does. My personal favorite is arc. You can see that kind of rounds out the area. It looks a lot nicer. So if you were to choose between the sharp or the arc, I think the arc looks way better. And you can also go into wireframe here and see how it's working topology wise. If I were to change this to sharp, you can see how that kind of pinches. There's patch, which kind of has more of an extension in the back. And then there's arc, which just has a very nice seamless transition between these two edges. As for inner miter type, I honestly never touched that, so I don't really have a practical use for it. I don't think I've ever had to change this to anything, and if you do, it just looks sloppy. You really only have to worry about the outer miter type. That's the main one. Now, limit method is an important one, and I've added in a cut here, just a simple cylinder cut, and you're going to see that literally every single edge in here is being beveled. It's very, very clear and apparent. So basically, if we change the limit method to angle, you're going to see it gets rid of that problem. So with the angle limit method, only adjacent faces that have an angle smaller than this value are going to be beveled. So that's basically how that's working. So you can see if I really drop this low, then those bevels on the ridges will come back, which is not what we want. But it looks like the default 30 degrees kind of captured everything just fine. So now we have a very smooth roundedness in here with no sort of weird bevel issue like that. Now I'd say somewhere around 70 to 80% of the time I use the angle limit method, and pretty much the rest of the time I use the weight limit method. We'll get into bevel weights later on in this handbook, but basically you're also allowed to bevel based off of your selected edges. So if I were to change this to weight, for example, nothing's going to be beveled because we haven't selected what we want to have beveled. But for example, I'll go ahead and apply these booleans here. So say I went in here and selected all these edges. We'll just do it for the cutters, and then I also went in here and selected these edges. If you press the N key and then go to item and increase the mean bevel weight, you're going to see it slowly starts marking these edges, and a value of 1 is a full bevel, and you're going to see that is affected because of our limit method being set to weight. And meanwhile, everything else will not be beveled because we haven't marked those edges yet, but if we do, you can see those get nicely beveled. And there's all sorts of ways to stack bevels and get different levels of bevels. For example, here I could reduce the mean bevel weight and have a much tinier one than I have over here. There's a lot of different things you could do, really. Most of the time, if you want to have different levels of bevels, you either adjust the mean bevel weight, or you can also use something called a step bevel. It's a little bit out of the focus of this course, but that's basically how the bevel modifier works in a nutshell. Now, you also have the option to mark certain areas with seams, and usually you use seams for unwrapping. In hard surface, most of the time you actually use seams to have different areas of selection. Let me demonstrate. So if I were to mark a seam manually around the entire top set of edges, I'll press Ctrl E and then mark seam. Check this out. If I try to select these upper faces, I don't want to have to do it manually. I can just press L and select the linked faces, and it will select everything encapsulated in this seam. Same for the bottom. You can see it's physically separate while being its own entire object. And also, if I remove the seam and then I try to select with the L key, it ends up selecting everything. So you can actually use this to separate physical areas of the geo. I don't usually have this on too much, but if there's a time I kind of want to isolate the edges I'm marking, then sometimes I'll tick on mark seams. Don't really stress about it too much. You'll run into a situation where you may need it or you may not need it. You also have the option to mark sharp based on the bevel if you want to do that. We've already done a video on the sharp options, so yeah, you also have the option to do that with the bevel modifier as well. Now, sometimes to keep things constrained, especially if you're using subsurf to increase mesh density, you'll usually want to use the mark crease option, and unfortunately that's not included with the bevel modifier by default. But if you have hard ops, you can actually just go to the Control tilde menu and turn that on manually. You can apply creases with your bevels as well, if that's something you want to do. And while we're on that topic, let's quickly discuss why an add-on like HardOps can help us with beveling, because vanilla just doesn't cut it sometimes. So if I want to bevel this cube, this is just the default cube, nothing on it. In Vanilla Blender, you have to go to Add Modifier, Bevel, segments up to 5 or whatever you want. You have to shade it smooth, then you have to adjust the offset, and then you have to turn on Auto Smooth, and then go back here to harden normals to clean up the shading, or you could also use a weighted normal, basically the same thing. You'd have to tick on that, and then finally you'd have to change the limit method to an angle, just to, angle, weight, whatever you're using. And how many different steps with that, like 5 or 6, and you can see how tedious that will really get, especially if you're using bevels a lot. But in HardOps, for example, it does all of this for you by default. So if I just start a completely new scene here, literally nothing in it, we'll just add a new cube. So by default, we don't have auto smooth on or anything, we don't have bevel, we have nothing. In HardOps, if you press Q, you can hop right into the bevel. Done. Completely finished. You're going to see auto smooth is turned on. You can adjust the angle. It was on 60 by default there, which I think is fine. So yeah, auto smooth is turned on by default. It sets the limit method to angle. It sets the segments appropriately, which you can also adjust. You can just scroll up or down. And then offset, super easy because I don't have to drag in here. I can just pull the mouse forward or backwards like this. And you can adjust all the same settings in the bevel modifier with HardOps. You can literally increase your scroll wheel to get more of a bevel. You can adjust the limit method. You can adjust the angle. You can do everything with just a few keyboard clicks in HardOps. So that's why add-ons like these are just a lot better to use and will really improve your workflow. And commonly in hard surface modeling, you'll be stacking booleans with bevels all the time. And the nice thing about HardOps is if I add in a cut, for example, not only does it sort it in the modifier stack by putting it above the bevel, because if we swapped them, that's no good. By default in Blender, you'd have to manage the modifier stack manually, but HardOps does it automatically for you. So whenever you add in a Boolean cut, you don't have to stress about the stack. It puts it right where it should go, and you can see how nicely it adds in little bevel cuts for you. So you can really begin to see how useful the bevel modifier is and how you can start stacking this with other modifiers to get really cool designs, much like the ones we use in hard surface all the time. You can kind of adjust the offset whenever you need to. You can do everything you need to do with just a few simple Boolean cuts and bevels.